To support our discussions with the world's leading thinkers, please see the video description or visit eism.eu/support. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to A Theory of Everything. Today we have the privilege of talking to one of the most influential voices in neuroscience, Professor Earl K. Miller, the Picower Professor of Neuroscience at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Professor Miller is the recipient of a variety of awards and serves as editor and on the editorial boards of major journals in neuroscience. His 2001 paper with Jonathan Cohen, which presented a new framework for understanding the prefrontal cortex, is the fifth most cited paper in the history of neuroscience. Despite all of that, for reasons I'm about to explain, I think the import and pivotal role of Professor Miller's work has yet to be fully appreciated. Professor Miller and his team at MIT studied the neural basis of executive brain functions, which is the ability to carry out goal-directed behavior using complex mental processes. If you're a regular listener of this channel, you'll immediately understand our interest in Miller's work on goal-directedness, and you might have even connected the concept of goals to the work of past guests like Carl Friston, Michael Levin, Eliyahu Cohen, and others. In fact, the running hypothesis of this channel is that goals, or what we might refer to as, more technically, boundary conditions, sit at the heart of all science, beginning at the quantum level, which we've seen in Yakir Aharonov's two-time approach to quantum mechanics, going all the way up to the cosmological level, where Juan Maldacena's work on the final state of black holes is now converging with some of the latest advances in error correction and shadow tomography in quantum computing. If Professor Miller is on the right track, and there's compelling reasons to believe that he is, then his work on the electrical activity of brain waves and the top-down influence of these brain waves on the microscopic structure of the brain itself is much more revolutionary than it might at first appear. In fact, I'm going to go out on a limb here to conjecture that a correct understanding of Miller's work serves as a sort of bridge, an empirical bridge, that connects fundamental physics to social science and vice versa, social science to fundamental physics, which is why I previously said that Professor Miller's work has yet to be fully appreciated. I hope you listen to the exchange with an open mind. What we're talking about has important implications for science and for everything that matters to all of us. As always, you'll find a timestamp and a list of relevant papers in the video description. If you're an expert and would like to voice your objections, please let me know. I'd be happy to have you on as a guest. Thanks again for your continued support. Here is my exchange with Professor Earl K. Miller. Professor Miller, thank you so much for taking the time to talk. It's an honor to have you today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So we agreed to talk about your paradigm-shifting work in neuroscience and about a recent paper of yours on something you refer to as cytoelectric coupling, which I think squares very nicely with some of the things we're trying to do here at ASIM. And but before we get into that, however, I thought it would be interesting, and I can't help but asking if you would be nice enough to share your experience or whatever you'd like to share about the journey from your excuse me, from your hometown in, I think, Pennsylvania. Is it Pennsylvania?
Cleveland, Ohio.
Cleveland, Ohio.
Yep.
From Cleveland, Ohio to leading a lab at one of the most prestigious institutions on the planet. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. I mean, life is kind of like a Kurt Vonnegut novel. Random stuff happens, and then you end up wherever you are. I mean, there's a lot of luck is involved in everything in life, and I'm no exception. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and as an undergraduate, I went to Kent State University, a very fine institution. Really started me off in my career as a scientist. And I didn't know what I wanted to major in when I was in college, and I took a year of physics, and then I took psychology classes, and I decided I wanted to go to medical school. And someone said, "Oh, you should volunteer to work in a research laboratory because that'll help you get into medical school." So I volunteered to work in a neuroscience laboratory where they were studying the hippocampus. And from the moment I did my first experiment, I think that moment I decided I don't want to go to medical school. I want to be a scientist. It was just so cool to actually be finding out something new and recording electrical activity from the brain. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. So I changed my mind and decided to go to graduate school and become a scientist. And I'm lucky that worked out.
Excellent. And tell me about the transition from Kent State to, you ended up at Princeton, correct?
Yeah, so I applied to a bunch of graduate schools, and for reasons I don't know, and he never told me, Charlie Gross at Princeton University took an interest in me and invited me to come visit his laboratory. And that was out of the blue because I was studying the hippocampus and Charlie studied the visual system, but there must have been something about my application. He never told me what it was, actually. I don't know why someone who didn't have the experience that his laboratory had, he just took a chance on me, and I visited, and I thought that was really cool work. And I ended up getting a PhD with Charlie 5 years later, and great experience. Charlie was one of the great neuroscientists of the 20th century. He taught me a lot. Very wise man. Then after that, I went on to do a postdoc of another wise man, Robert Desimone, who was my postdoc mentor and my friend. He's now that was at the NIH, where I spent 5 years, and then in 1995 I was offered a faculty position at MIT, and I've been here ever since. And since then, Bob Desimone was at the NIH, and now he's not only my friend, but he's also my colleague here at MIT. So that's nice.
Excellent. And how did your leadership of the Miller Lab, how did that come about?
Well, the leadership, I mean, you're thrust into the role of a leader of a laboratory. I mean, that's when you take a faculty position in a university, they give you space, a little bit of startup money, then you have to write grants and acquire funding. Then you use that to take on graduate students and postdocs. And it's kind of like running a small business in a way. You're managing a bunch of people. So, how did I acquire a leader? It was handed to me, and I had to be a leader, and I think it worked out.
Yeah, at the same time, you've been able to put out some really remarkable and influential work since then. What do you think has been the key factor behind this success?
Well, I mean, it's not really for me to say, but if I had to say, which I guess I do, because you just asked me, I would say that I have a healthy disrespect for dogma. I think that we don't know anything, and everything we know now is a stepping stone to somewhere else. So I'm very skeptical of dogma, and even my personal dogma, anything that I come up with, I'm skeptical of that and want to move beyond that, because personal dogma is the worst. It sucks you in the most. We have to keep moving forward in science, and we're supposed to be, science is like this balance between tradition, what's plausible, and rebellion. Like let's move beyond that. And I think I've always erred on the side of wanting to move beyond what we know now and not hang on to paradigms. And I learned that from Charlie Gross. Charlie Gross was, in addition to being a brilliant neuroscientist, he had a great interest and wrote books about the history of neuroscience. And when you have that kind of grand sweep of history, what you acquire, what you realize, and what Charlie taught us, is that everything we do now is a stepping stone to something else. So don't get hung up on anything you think you know now. We should be trying to disprove things, not prove them.
Excellent. Can you talk a little bit about because I want to make a transition to the paradigm shift, which is a recurring theme in a lot of your work and a lot of your talks. Can you take us back to Charlie Gross and his era? What were the main ideas that were most influential back then?
Yeah, so the paradigm back then, this is not just Charlie Gross's era, this is my era too. I was a graduate student in 1985, and the way we thought about the brain back then is that we thought about it in pieces, in piecemeal fashion. We talked about the function of individual brain areas, what different brain areas do. We talked about the function of individual neurons. And that's kind of the way we thought about things back then. We thought that every neuron had one function and one function only, and neurons work when they give off what's called action potentials, little electrical impulses, and they signal one another that way. But every neuron has one function, and they influence other neurons through this electrical signaling. And so we kind of thought of the brain kind of like clockwork, is that every neuron had one function, was like one gear in a giant machine, and that was as one function only. Now, we think differently now, but I want to make it clear, there's nothing wrong with that way of thinking. That way of thinking was foundational. Back, modern neuroscience is not that old. It was mid 20th century, let's say. And, before you figure out how all the parts work together, how something as complex as the brain all works together with different pieces interacting, you got to figure out the pieces first. I mean, that's just natural. Anything, you got to figure out the pieces first. So that was an important way of thinking. It was a groundbreaking way of thinking at the time, because before that, people didn't even know what neurons did. But just the fact that we can get some information out of individual neurons was a huge breakthrough. Started with Hubel and Wiesel and others. And that was important foundational work. But now, in the 21st century, we're sort of like moving to a different paradigm where we're looking at emergent properties, how all the pieces work together, function together as a whole. And that isn't to say that studying single neurons isn't still important. Of course it is. We got a lot to figure out about how the brain works, but it's clear that the brain is more than the sum of its parts, and it's the kind of that gestalt sum of how things interact that we're looking at right now.
Well, this is very interesting, this transition from looking at things from sort of bottom up, and now in terms of emerging properties, there's sort of a top-down approach to science. Can you say more about this?
Well, it's more of a collective focus. So it's like emergent properties. And what it is, an emergent property is a property you see at the group level that can't be reduced to its individual members. Individual members don't have that property. And sometimes people hear that and think, oh, it sounds like it's emergent properties mean it's like difficult or complex or it's magic somehow. It's none of that. It's a property of nature. Everything around you has emergent properties. But so what emergent properties are, imagine a football stadium of a crowd in a football stadium doing the wave. They stand up and down and the wave moves around the crowd, right? So that's an emergent property. Now, imagine, to make it simple, let's reduce this wave down to just two sports fans and they're standing up and down doing their own two-person wave, right? Okay. If you studied those people one at a time, like we used to study neurons one at a time, you would come to the conclusion people stand up and down. It's only when you study them together do you see they have this phase offset that makes the wave. And that's it. That's what emergent properties are. It's things that happen at the level of neurons working together as a whole that you can't see at the level of individual neurons. And some of those things are things like oscillatory dynamics in the brain, brain waves. Brain waves, back in the old paradigm when we used to think about individual neurons, brain waves were kind of thought of as brain waves are these things, if you just put EEG electrodes in your scalp, you see these squiggly lines. And they're what they are just changes in electrical potential in the brain. And what they reflect is millions of neurons activating and deactivating together. That's what makes the wave. But back, when we used to think about under the paradigm, we used to think about the brain one neuron at a time. These brain waves were kind of considered like the humming of a car engine. They reflect the engine running, but they don't actually make the engine work. Now, in actuality, that's not even a good analogy, because the rhythms of the engine actually do make the engine work, because if you don't design the engine right for the parts for the rhythms to reinforce one another, then the engine will break apart. But leaving aside the bad analogy, that's the way they used to think, that it was just like these brainwaves didn't really do anything. And now what we're realizing is that they're very functional. They're actually centered how the brain produces a lot of function. And what they are, just like a crowd doing the wave in a stadium, they reflect the organized activity of millions of neurons. Millions of neurons are activating, then deactivating all together, the level of not individual neurons, but millions of neurons all together. Now, why is that important? Well, when your brain has to make decisions, produce behavior, focus attention, your brain has hundreds of millions of neurons, and your brain has to get a lot of neurons on the same page doing the same thing. Well, that's the level at which brain waves organize activity. These oscillatory dynamics, they reflect a natural organization that the brain evolution learned to exploit to control brain processing, to control brain function.
Okay, can you talk about, I think maybe one of the most controversial aspects, maybe controversial is not the right word, but we'll use it anyway. One of the most controversial aspects of your work and the language that you use involves causality. Mm-hmm. Is this a correct way to describe your situation or your work?
Oh no, well, I think you're talking about there's this, we wrote a paper a little while last year with several colleagues about causality in the brain. And the point of that was that people often assume that causality manipulation, that's really not a controversial thing. It's just sort of an edifying thing, is that people often assume that causality is straightforward in the brain. If I use some sort of probe or some genetic tool and shine light and I activate a bunch of neurons and something else happens in the brain, it must be that A affected B. Well, it isn't always that straightforward. Causality is sort of treated as something that's straightforward and a golden standard for studying the brain, when actually it's a really valuable tool, but it's not a golden standard because the relationships aren't quite as simple. And the best way I can describe that is imagine a typical type of experiment in neuroscience of this type. And that is, someone will activate one brain area, and they'll record the response in another brain area, then look at the change in behavior. And you can see it's the human level. You do TMS and you record. You can do all sorts of, you can do it in humans, you can do it in animals. But the point is, you're manipulating one part of the brain, looking at the consequence in another part of the brain, and then behavior changes. So people assume that's the way it goes. It goes manipulation A to B to behavior. But what if what's going on instead is that you manipulate brain area A, and that changes the animal or person's behavior, and that change in behavior is what's being reflected in the area B in the brain. So causality often takes it. People assume it's a direct link, but sometimes it's a roundabout route. So, and the only point of that paper was that, the important point of that paper was that causality manipulations are not straightforward in the brain, and we have to realize they're more complex than people normally assume they are.
Okay, can you elaborate a little bit more on when you talk about top down and bottom up movement in the brain?
Right, so what bottom up is the raw sensory information flooding into your brain. And what top down is your volition, your control. It's how your brain organizes its own thoughts. So that's top down are the executive brain functions. They're the functions of your brain that tell the rest of your brain, pay attention to this, do that. I want to accomplish this, then I have to do this. That's what we refer to as executive functions. And executive functions are top-down functions and produce so-called top-down signaling that allows the brain to control itself and direct its action toward goals and pay attention to certain things and make certain choices. And that's why we think these brain rhythms are so important, because when you think about these brain waves, these oscillating dynamics in the brain, electric circuits, neural networks will naturally begin to oscillate. They get complex enough, they'll naturally begin to oscillate. You're building a radio, if you're not careful, you'll get unwanted oscillations in electric circuits. But so what probably happens, this is not it's more of a philosophy and a theory, so I can't go and test this in a straightforward way, but somewhere along, as the nervous systems got more and more complicated, they naturally began to oscillate. And again, what oscillations are they're the organized activity of millions of neurons. And evolution, probably, I can exploit that. I need to make a more complex brain that can do goal-directed things instead of just responding to the world, which is what, bottom-up creatures, simple creatures, will just respond to the world. There's food there, I'll go get it. If there's light there, I'll swim away from it. But we humans can do more. We are more open-ended. We could decide, we don't respond to the world, we change the world. We decide we want a different future state, and we can make that come about. And that's where this top-down stuff comes in. But in order to do that, your brain has to learn to control its own thoughts. And these oscillatory dynamics, since these natural oscillations reflect the organization of millions of neurons acting together, evolution found a way to sculpt that and use to control the brain's functioning.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. That's so fascinating. This idea of goal-directed behavior, or goal-directedness in brain activity. Is this something that's been controversial in the past in neuroscience, or has it been something that's always acceptable and talked about?
Oh, it's always been acceptable and talked about goal-directed behavior, because even like the early days of psychology, people were studying like operant conditioning and maze running with maze running with rodents. That's goal-directed behavior. But I would say that because of back, in the 20th century, when we were first starting to study the brain, we were sort of more focused on the edges of the brain, the inputs and outputs. How does the brain process sensory information? How does the brain produce action, like moving my arm? And that was an important first step, because again, if you don't know anything, you got to start at the edges and work your way in. And that's studying how the brain either reacts to the environment, or how the brain produces action on the environment, but not in a goal-directed way, just producing a motor response, often in response to that stimulus. Stimulus response, simple stuff. But it's only when we began to learn how that stuff works where we begin to now put it together, and there's more of a much more work going on now on the neural basis of executive functions and top-down type things. But I wouldn't say it was because it was controversial. I would say that we didn't have the knowledge and tools a while back, and now we have them, and people are asking more and more questions along those lines.
Very interesting. Now, this concept of goal-orientedness and top-down, I can't help but ask about time, the relationship to time. Is that something that has entered into your research, or how do you think about time in your studies?
Oh, sure, it's a great question. I mean, one thing that humans are really, really good at, we're good at thinking, making plans, setting goals that are often days, weeks, months, even years into the future. I mean, look how much time I spent in school, for example. And that's part of this process that what the human brain is very good at is making generalizations and abstractions. And I'll sidetrack into that for just a moment, and I'll tie it back to time. And that is, humans, like, we're really, really good at amassing information, sort of figuring out generating hypotheses how the world works, figuring out generalizations. Like, I have a concept of justice or fairness, and I have been treated justly or fairly. I've heard examples of justice and fairness for many, many, many years, and now I have this general concept of justice and fairness. Now, what that is, that's a high-level abstract concept that applies to a whole lot of situations. And that's data compression in your brain. And that's an important thing your brain needs to do, because if you want to have high-level thought, you can't think about every little possible detail. If you want to think about something like justice, you can't think about every single time you've been treated unfairly or unjustly. You can't think at that level, because that overwhelms your brain. Your brain has a very limited capacity for conscious thought. We're very single-minded. So the brain's got to find out a way to compress all these experiences into labels that stand for a lot of things, and then we can think about those things and fit them into our minds, and then do high-level thought. So that's the process of abstraction and generalization. Well, it's the same process that leads you to, if you can generalize among a whole bunch of different experiences, it's natural that you also can generalize to the future, from the present to the future. It's part of the same process. Developing things like abstraction schemas for like an abstract representation of how to dine in a restaurant. Now you know how to dine in future restaurants. You know what they're about, and you could choose to go to future restaurants in the future. So this process of developing these high-level abstract representations that really compress data and allow our brains to work together, planning for the future and generalizing to the future, is just part of the same process. It's another form of generalization.
Yeah, excellent. And this planning for the future at the psychological level, cognitive level, if I understand some of your work correctly, this boils down to oscillations in the brain, and these oscillations then have a way, through your cytoelectric coupling thesis, have a way of then tuning the microstructure of the brain and the neuronal elements. Is that correct?
Correct. That's exactly right. And it sort of is two things. So we've published two theories in the past year. One is spatial computing, and that determines how it posits how all these waves actually organize behavior, thought, and action, like just we were talking about earlier, how what the brain does is sends these patterns of waves that create patterns of activity and inactivity in the rest of your brain. And by the waves controlling which neurons are allowed to be activated and which ones aren't, in other words, controlling where on the networks of your brain's information is allowed to be expressed, that's how your brain does computation. So we're looking at these waves as these oscillatory rhythms as a way of the brain actually doing computation. Then my colleague, and that's a colleague of mine, Michael Levin, who spearheaded that theory. But another colleague of mine, Dimitris Panos, is working along the same lines. Dimitris, we are discussing this idea of oscillatory dynamics, and he came up with the idea, give him the credit for it, this idea that oscillatory dynamics, they not just control not just information processing and computation in the brain, they actually work down to the level of proteins in the brain. They can actually have these electrical fields, these oscillating, changing electric fields can actually influence the brain down to the molecular level. And that does, it fine tunes the brain, it fine tunes networks so they function more efficiently. And we amassed a whole bunch of evidence, like if you look at like developmental biology, how do the cells in your hand know how to make the shape of a hand? Well, one prominent theory is they follow electrical gradients. Nerve degeneration follows electric gradients. So the idea is that if electric fields work and help the biology structure itself, if they're going to be fluctuating in the brain, one natural consequence may be that it helps the brain fine tune itself so it processes these rhythms, processes information more effectively. And what's exciting about it is that there's never been, as far as I know, a connection between how the brain structures its networks on the molecular level, down in like the protein level, the little tiny elements that make up the networks, and how that connects to information on the thought level. And because the idea is because these electrical fields can influence biology and can influence the structure of biology and the structure of the brain, and because these fluctuating electric fields of the brain are carrying information, it's a way for information to fine tune how the brain operates. And I think that was a pretty profound insight, if I may say so myself.
Absolutely. I think it's very profound, and it seems like the implications are far-reaching. You've covered a lot of ground. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Think about it. If you think about those, so the standard way we think of the way networks form in the brain is fire together, wire together. It's like if two neurons fire at the same time or fire in a certain temporal relationship, they'll strengthen their connection. And that is how the brain sort of creates its general infrastructure. That's very, very important. It's like building the road and highway system of your brain. But now that you have these networks all put together, you have to make them function more efficiently. They have to, for lack of a better, they have to harmonize that together, because if they're processing these fluctuating fields and these electrical activity moving around them, if they work together better, they'll work together more efficiently and more robustly. So how do you do that? You can't do that by this fire together, wire together thing, because that builds networks in the brain one piece at a time. And by definition, getting networks to harmonize means they got to work together well. And the idea of these electrical fields, because they have this influence in biology, by structuring, by changing and sculpting these networks, they can actually fine tune them like you're tuning up a guitar string. And that's the way it has to. I think that's the way it's kind of got to be done, because you want networks to work together better. If you want them to harmonize, they have to be able to influence one another as they're working. And electrical fields spread influences at the speed of light. So it's a great way for all these networks to sort of influence one another as they're working and fine tune their structure to make them work together better.
Yeah, fantastic. I can't help but come back to the concept of time. How does time play into these dynamics that you're talking about?
Well, time in the brain sense, there's two things: time in the brain sense, and then we talk about time in our life sense. But time in the brain sense is very important, and that's one of the things that's really kind of important about these oscillations, is that they don't just jump up and down they're not standing waves. They don't go up and down like a jump rope. What these oscillations form are what's called traveling waves. They move across the cortex in waves, like ocean waves. They go back and forth and they rotate. And what that is not just it's not just the organized activity of millions of neurons in a big up and down kind of way, but it's a way of sculpting activity. They move around, okay? So that's a very precise, like, scalpel by which you can influence things in the brain, these electrical fields that are moving around. And what's interesting about traveling waves, not only do they allow a way of precisely organizing things in networks in the brain, is that they naturally have they keep track of time and recent network activation. And that's really, really important for any neural computation. You want to know what's happened recently and how long ago did it happen. Your brain needs that information in order to do computation. And just having these electrical waves, just the fact that they're there and moving, that important information just falls out of them naturally. And the way to explain that is, imagine I take a video of a pond and I drop 4 pebbles in the pond one at a time. I can then show you a still photograph from that pond, and from any frame, you could tell me how many pebbles have dropped, when they dropped, and how long ago they dropped, just from a still photograph, just from the patterns of the waves moving out from the pebble dropping. That's what traveling waves do in the brain. These electrical signals moving across the brain in organized ways, they naturally give the brain its own sense of time passing and on the level at which the brain needs to make things happen.
Okay, can you review quickly what impact it has, the fact that, or the idea that these oscillations then impact down to the neuronal level? In other words, there's a top-down impact or causality.
Yep.
Why would the oscillations do, or what's the benefit of the brain getting this top-down movement or causality?
Well, the benefit of it is that because the electrical fields carry information, and they're actually carrying thoughts, and they're carrying the information the brain is processing. And by percolating down to the level of individual proteins, like scaffolding proteins in the brain, the microstructure of how networks work, it's a way of information itself to fine-tune the brain's networks to process information more effectively. When you want to fine-tune networks so that the brain's an information processor. You want to fine-tune the network so they can process information better. You need some way for information to actually fine-tune the brain's networks to make the networks work better. And this is the connection we believe, and it's the connection I don't believe anybody made before Dimitri suggested it.
Yeah, very interesting. I can't help but ask about intelligence, and if any of your work or any of your theorizing is connected to the study of intelligence itself in terms of IQ, psychometric testing, etc.
In a way, we study something called cognitive capacity, and cognitive capacity is the bandwidth of your mind. And your cognitive capacity, people have a very limited cognitive capacity. If I give you a very simple test, I show you a screen of a few colored squares or something, and I say, remember all these colored squares, your average person can remember 4 or 5 colored squares. So that's a very simple, hold these 4 colored squares in mind, and that's it. That's the limitation of your conscious mind. Now, there's a lot going on unconsciously in your brain, but for some reason, the conscious thoughts have this very narrow bandwidth. And that's a very simple situation, 4 or 5 colored squares. When we think about complex thoughts, we're very single-minded. Like right now, you and I are hopefully both focused largely on what each other is saying. And we don't have a room for a lot of other stuff going on because otherwise we'd be distracted. Well, we're trying to figure out why the brain has this limitation. Why did your brain evolve in a way that has this limited bandwidth? There's such narrow straw for processing conscious information on a conscious level. And if we figure that out, we'll learn something about consciousness. Now, why cognitive capacity is important related to intelligence, is that different people have different capacities. Some people can hold 1 or 2 things in mind simultaneously. Other people can hold 7 or 8. It varies along a continuum. Well, that continuum, your individual bandwidth, whether it's narrow or wider still, that correlates highly with measures of fluid intelligence. And what that may be is that something, obviously more to intelligence than just that, but it's just very helpful if you have a wider bandwidth, you can fit more information into it, think about more things simultaneously, and you can have more complex thoughts and more high-level thoughts. That's the general idea. Now, there'll be more to intelligence than that. My friend and colleague John Duncan in Cambridge, his theory is that what makes intelligence is the ability of the brain to identify goals and overarching goals and organize them into sub goals and do that effortlessly. The more effortlessly you could do that, the higher the fluid intelligence. But that may have to do with this bandwidth. If your bandwidth is wider,
yeah, it seems connected. No, yeah, interesting. Well, previously you mentioned, or I'm sorry, in your paper on cytoelectric coupling, you cite the work of Michael Levin, synthetic biologist Michael Levin at the University of Tufts. And previously today, you mentioned the idea that there's goal-directed behavior and the role of electricity. So these two aspects, the fact that bioelectricity can actually impact how the brain functions, and how, in the case of Michael Levin, how flatworms are able to regenerate their own bodies.
Right.
Where does the physics of this fit into your work? How deeply do you get into the physics of it?
Well, I'm not a physicist. I do know enough about electric fields and stuff to be dangerous, I guess, if you put it that way. But I'm not a physicist. I'm also not a molecular biologist. So the cytoelectric coupling hypothesis is very much it is a hypothesis right now. It's not it's needs to be tested. And I'm not a molecular biologist, but I am talking to molecular biology colleagues that are interested in testing this, and that's where the test really needs to be made. I can't do all the science myself.
Sure. Well, very interestingly, Michael Levin talks about goals at the biological level, and he gets a lot of pushback precisely because of this idea that the paradigm is shifting. And so what he says is, listen, this is the way I'm talking about my work. And it's important to talk about this because it actually affects the way we set up experiments and the way we get results, et cetera. Mm-hmm. If you have a better way to talk about this, then show me. Yeah. But for the moment, I'm getting results in talking about goal-directedness at the cellular level. And a big part of his research is the electrical fields and electrical charges and their impact on ion channels. And it seems like I can't help but make a connection to a lot of what you're doing. In fact, you cited him in your paper.
Oh, yeah, so I know him too. Yeah.
Yeah, that seems so interesting and so fascinating.
I mean, if you think about it, look at Michael's work. I mean, like if electric fields can influence biology, it'd be weird if it didn't influence the brain, especially your brain's like an electrical chemical machine. That's the place where, if any place is going to be affected by electrical fields in biology, it's going to be your brain. And the fact is, the rest of your body's affected by electric fields. So there you go. It seemed like a connection that was ready to be made.
Sure, it makes a lot of sense. In fact, I would take it a little bit further. In fact, we're actually collaborating with Michael Levin on a project here in Europe to bring a lot of the math that he's using, and presumably a lot of math that you're using, to study the impact on social systems. So take it even one step higher. Obviously, it's still very speculative, but the claims that are being made are empirical in nature. So like a lot of your work, it's the results are, in the end, there's an expression, the proof is in the pudding, no? Yes. Finally, if you get results out of this, that's what matters.
Yeah, really, the only bad hypothesis is one you can't test.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Talk to us about the formation of thoughts and ideas and the prefrontal cortex. Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate on this? This was part of your earlier work, and I think, in fact, your most influential paper was on this.
Yeah. So the prefrontal cortex is the executive part of your brain. I mean, there's no one really executive part of your brain, but if there's a hierarchy, and the prefrontal cortex is at the top of that hierarchy, and this is the part of your brain that's involved in recognizing goals, predicting goals, and coming up with plans to make those goals come about. And so essentially what the prefrontal cortex does is sort of absorbs the rules of our society and then uses that to navigate complex situations that make up our society to get us towards our goals. And when people have damage to that part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, they become what's called stimulus bound. They just respond to things that come along without any thought about the greater context. Is this the appropriate thing to do in this situation? Is it the wrong thing to do? Is it the right thing to do? What are the consequences of this? They become people who react to the environment without thinking about the consequences. And, this is what the prefrontal cortex does. It figures out, the rules of society and knows what the consequences are and knows how to navigate those consequences to reach good consequences. And people when they have damaged part of the brain, they lose that ability and they become, just reactive in a reflexive way to the environment. And back when we started, back about 20 so years ago or now, the state of the art of studying the prefrontal cortex is something called working memory, how you hold stuff in mind. Now that is an important thing the prefrontal cortex does, but we thought, well, the prefrontal cortex, and that's, we still study that too. But the prefrontal goal-directed behavior has to be, the kind of things we're doing now have to be more than just holding stuff in mind. There's got to be some direction. There's got to be some executive direction. And Jonathan Cohn and I published in 2001, if you think for a second, a paper saying that what the prefrontal cortex does is it figures out these logic of goal-directed tasks. It figures out the logic of how the world works. And it doesn't just express this logic in some esoteric neural space. It expresses the logic in terms of what neural circuits need to be activated in the rest of your brain in order to make that thing come about. So here's a situation. The prefrontal cortex comes up with a map of here's how to navigate the situation, and it sends that map back to the rest of your posterior cortex and says, do this. So kind of prefrontal cortex is kind of like a traffic cop or a switch operator in a system of railroad yards. It has the big picture, it has the map, and it tells the trains where to go. And so that I would say I think that's been fairly influential paper. And the way we thought about it back then was in terms of the prefrontal cortex does this by spiking these electrical impulses, and it sends this map back to cortex by virtue of these electrical impulses. But now this model of spatial computing I mentioned earlier, I kind of think of that as the 21st century update. I'm actually talking to John Cohn about writing an update to this. But this is the updates. Is I mentioned earlier that what these brain waves do is they organize activity in the brain. Well, that's what the Miller and Cohn model is the prefrontal cortex organizing activity in the rest of your brain. So now I think, I don't want to speak for John because we haven't put together this plan for an update paper yet, but I think that this process of the prefrontal cortex directing the traffic is happening through these brain waves, these patterns of brain waves that the prefrontal cortex sends back to the rest of the cortex.
Well, for whatever it's worth, it seems like now is the time for an update. That would be very, very interesting. Super, super fascinating. Talk about a paradigm shift. It seems to me such an important difference in how to look at science and how to proceed with science, to think about both forward and kind of like a forward and backward, or up, bottom up and top down causality, if you will. Can you give us some words about where your work fits into neuroscience as a whole? Can you give us a quick sketch of neuroscience and where your research fits into that big picture?
I always say that this is not for me to say. It's for other people to decide where I fit in and what my impact is. But I guess I would say that one thing that I came from neuroscience from more of a cognitive science perspective. That was my majored in experimental psychology as an undergraduate at Kent State. And I got my initial training was in cognitive science and behavioral paradigms. And I think I kind of brought a cognitive science sensibility to neuroscience, where I was, our lab was one of the, this is a group work and not just me alone. Our lab was one of the first to really start studying the brain using the kind of complex tasks and operations and computer games, if you will, that we kind of asked people to do. So we began to study the brain. We began to reach these inner reaches where we're studying how the brain comes up with plans and goals, because we began to use a different level of complexity in our experimental design. And, I always try to be open-minded. So I think those two things. I mean, I was a single neuron person back in the day, but when new things come along and I think they're better, I'm happy to change my mind. And so when I was a postdoc, Bob Desimone and I published a paper in Science saying, here's a neural basis for working memory. And then we did a subsequent experiment that made us realize we were wrong. So we published a second paper, also got it published in Science, lucky us, that showed, our first paper was wrong. So and like another example is working memory. I studied working memory, this holding things in mind for years. And for many years, I studied it from this idea that what it mainly is sustained spiking, the sustained electrical impulses. Just fire, as long as you're holding something in mind, neurons are firing away. And then a model came along that showed that model by my colleague Michael Levin, and he showed me a very convincing model showing he built a computer model based on like pure biophysics up, and the model it did working memory in a very different way. It was more complex dynamics and sparse firing and these interaction between these two different frequency brainwaves, this complex dance. And then he came to the laboratory, and this is my pure computational model. And then we started testing in our data, and we started seeing it in all of our neurophysiological data. And this is, by the way, parenthetically, this is a great example of how the interplay between experimental work and computational modeling is that a computational model came up with hypotheses that we never would have thought to ask from the data from first principles. It generated hypotheses, we've been testing the data. And then when I realized that there was this eerie matchup, that the model made all these predictions on things we never looked at before, and it's been true ever since. As now we've published on this stuff for 10 years now. I threw away the way I used to think about working memory. Now I think about it in a different way. So I guess I'm willing to overturn the apple cart, even if it's my own apple cart.
Excellent. And what about reductionism? Reductionism seems to have played a very important role for at least a couple of centuries. How does reductionism, or how does your work affect, or what implications does your work have for the old reductionist approach to science?
Well, we still need reductionistic approaches because there's a lot of complexity to the brain. We don't know how all the pieces work. So there's got to be people who study the brain down to the molecular level, the single synapse level. That's all very, very important work. So reductionism is still very, very important. But reductionism only is not the way to go. And that's what I think, especially, my work over the years has moved from this, kind of single neuron reductionist to this more putting it all together emergent property approach. And I think that we have to, reductionism is important. We have to also leave room for the realization there's a lot more going on than just, pieces functioning independently.
Excellent. Well, I noticed that you cited Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose in your recent paper. Can you elaborate on why you think their work may indicate some level of support for these ideas?
Well, I'm not a physicist, and I'm sure not a quantum physicist, so I can't go into any details here. We just noted that one of the things we pointed out in the cytoelectric coupling paper is that these electrical fields are known to affect microtubules in the brain, and microtubules is where Roger Penrose and Stuart, where they thought that these quantum computations were going on that led to consciousness. Now, I can't speak to that. I'm just saying that the electrical fields are influencing the microtubules. So if there's something there might be a connection.
Well, if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, because if in fact these high-level oscillations are impacting microphysical elements, then that impact would then go down even further to the quantum level. It seems,
and if there's something there
influence.
Should be an influence.
Sure.
Exactly.
Sure.
Influence. And I will say that again, remember, all these fluctuating electrical fields are carrying information. So it's a way of information, something we think of the macro level in the brain. It's what my brain does, my brain is thinking about. And all the cytoelectric coupling is a way for information happening at this macro level to influence the brain all the way down to the molecular level and possibly beyond. So it just imbues everything down to the smallest parts of the brain with information. And I think that's pretty important, but I'm biased.
No. I think we're biased. That's very, very fascinating. It's very interesting because there's one direction where these oscillations, they affect downward, right? Downward in terms of scale. At the same time, there's another level of fascination here because those brain oscillations represent, if I understood you correctly, thoughts and ideas and abstractions. Mm-hmm. Correct?
Correct.
Okay, so thoughts and ideas, abstractions then move us up in scale through neuroscience to things like psychology, morality, social science, economics, voting theory.
It's all coming from the brain. Yep.
Yeah. Have you given much thought to this? Because there's a scale invariance here that seems like chock full of meaning and potential significance for science. Have you given this much thought?
Well, I like the idea you're applying Michael's equations at this level. That's very exciting. I really want to hear more about that. I hope you'll keep me posted on that. I haven't thought about it in terms of on the larger social level because I'm not an economist, I'm not a sociologist, but of course it's going to be a continuum up from the level of the brain up to that level because that's what our brains create. So more power to you. I hope you make headway with that.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you very much. Well, let's switch a little bit here and let's talk a little bit about what you might recommend for some young person, maybe in high school, who's interested in going into neuroscience or interested in the brain, or maybe in college. What kind of things would you recommend?
I think that I have two practical recommendations. One is that learn math, and two, learn coding, because those things are increasingly valuable. And neuroscience is becoming more and more computational, more and more mathematical for the reasons I mentioned earlier, is that we're now beginning to focus on these emergent properties, and these emergent properties require complex math. So that's where the whole field is kind of going. So I would learn as much math as you can. And the other thing, learn to code, because you're going to need to use that math, and that's what you need to code to analyze data and make models and stuff like that. And so I think that's where neuroscience is going. So I would definitely put those two tools in my toolkit. And the other thing is that in case things don't work out in science, not everybody ends up being a faculty member. Those two skills will serve you in a lot of jobs. As will the ability to communicate well. So learn your writing too.
Excellent.
And tell us about. I add one more philosophical point, and again,
sure.
You probably can see this coming from what I've said, is that it's always important to keep open-minded in science. I would say if you're going forward in science, just remind yourself to be open-minded, because I think sometimes people in science, they make some major discoveries and they try to prevent the field from moving beyond those discoveries because they don't want to be felt to be irrelevant. But they're not irrelevant. That work is a major step. Any work is a major stepping stone to something else. So it's important not to hang on to your dogma. It's important to be open-minded.
Interesting comment. Question. Do you think that most scientists are open-minded, or is there a little bit of reluctance to accept, for example, in this paradigm shift, I get the feeling that there's still some level of resistance from some of the old vanguard. Is that the case, or am I wrong?
There's still some resistance in the old vanguard, but I think the pendulum has definitely swung, and that's just the last remnants of the old paradigm. But again, the old paradigm is still valuable. It's still important to do that kind of like reductionistic work. So no one's, I'm not saying it's irrelevant. I'm just saying that in terms of how people feel about it, definitely it went from like everybody thought about this way, and now where the pendulum is the paradigm has shifted, and there's always going to be some people who get brought along kicking and screaming, I guess. But so how many scientists are open-minded? That's where this notion of paradigm shift comes from, is that scientists are people, and they naturally sometimes resist new things, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, we can't accept any new idea that comes along. Ideas have to prove themselves over the years, but the problem comes in when occasionally an idea has kind of proven itself and people are still resisting it. But that's where paradigm shifts come from. Science doesn't proceed linearly. It's one way and then it switches to another way. So, it may not be a straight path forward, it may be a bit of a stagger forward, but it does move forward.
Excellent. What are some of the challenges that you're working on now, and what would you like to accomplish next?
Oh, figure out more of how the brain does what it does. I mean, one of the things I'm working on with a colleague, Emery Brown here at MIT, and we're trying to figure out why anesthesia makes the brain unconscious. And it may be disturbing to know, because anesthesia has been around for many, many, many years, that medical doctors still don't know why it makes you unconscious. It doesn't just, and we found out there's been this tacit assumption it kind of just shuts off your cortex. That's not what happens at all. We published a paper a couple years ago showing that it actually changes these brain waves. It shifts the brain waves to a different frequency domain. And we want to figure out why that makes you unconscious, because if we can do that, we can find out ways to make anesthesia safer and deliver it safer, and use monitoring of brain activity to make sure you get the right amount of anesthesia and not the wrong amount of anesthesia. Those are the practical reasons for doing this work. But the other reason, the academic, if you will, reason is that if you can figure out what makes you unconscious, we get a little window of insight into why some thoughts are conscious and why some aren't.
Excellent. What are some of the your favorite parts about running a lab at MIT, and some of your least favorite parts about that?
Well, I love science. I'm here because I love science, and I love figuring out puzzles, and I love seeing new data and new discoveries. It still excites me. I walk into our laboratory and I hear electrical activity being played on the loudspeaker from the brain, and I still have this Pavlovian response to it. It still excites me. So if you like figuring things out, science is the way to spend your life, and the brain is the most complex interactive thing we know. So I like the open-ended nature of it, I'm under no delusion we're going to figure out the brain anytime in my lifetime, or maybe not several lifetimes, but that's what I love about it, is that it's so open-ended. There's so many questions you can ask, and each one gets you to a greater truth. You may never live to see that truth, but at least you're helping get there. So I just love science, and MIT is a great place to be. It's a very supportive environment. I have great colleagues here at MIT, very collaborative environment. I collaborate with a whole bunch of other faculty members here. My students are great. They're all students and postdocs, really bunch of talent. Again, this has all been a group effort. I've been leading the laboratory, but I have been working with a fantastic group of students and graduate students and postdocs over the years who do all the really important and hard work with doing actual experiments in science. So that's been the great part. The bad part, the bad part is having to apply for grant funding and stuff like that. Grant funding has been dropping over the years, and it's more and more competitive, and it's always a bit of stress when you have to write grants and you have to wait to get them reviewed, and that's never fun. The good part about writing grants is when you have to really put your ideas on the paper, it really focuses your plans and like a laser. But the bad part is having to, get them reviewed and respond to reviewers. It takes a lot of work because the funding levels are so low. So you got to constantly be thinking about either writing a grant or writing the next one.
How much of your time, if you don't mind me asking, is spent on grant writing?
It's hard to average out because there's, grants go through cycles. So sometimes I spend all my time writing grants. I'll spend like a couple months writing grants, and then sometimes I'll spend a couple months writing papers. That's actually so it's funny. I like writing. Writing is a favorite activity of mine, and grant writing is stressful. I don't mind the writing process. I like writing, but paper writing is what I really enjoy, because when I'm writing a paper, I'm communicating something that will be read to the outside world. I'm doing something that's, I think, my job is to not only make discoveries, but communicate it to my fellow scientists in the outside world. And I love writing papers for that reason, because I know other people are going to read this. You put a lot of effort into a grant, and maybe 3 people will read it if you're lucky. But on the other hand, it really does focus your thought. Everything is a bit of plus and minus, isn't it? But I do like writing papers. I do like communicating science. So that's a real joy in my job.
Excellent. I keep thinking to myself that our time is running out, and I'm going to ask the last question. And I thought it was the last question, but I'd like to ask you one more, if it's okay.
Okay.
Or two more before the final one. What are your thoughts about the recent controversies surrounding artificial intelligence and, for example, ChatGPT, these kinds of things? And are they related to your work, or is it completely distinct?
Well, ChatGPT, I mean, there's some elements of it that kind of work like some things the brain does, like pattern recognition and changing changing weights of connections and stuff like that. But that's just an ankle deep into the complexity of what the brain is. And by the way, that's one of my general comments about AI. Well, not AI, but neural network modeling is that neural network modeling AI wants to they use the brain as inspiration. Well, they still kind of think of the brain as the way we thought about it in the 20th century, with individual elements influencing one another and changing weights. When, as we discussed for the past hour or so, there's a lot more going on in the brain than just that. So for neural network modeling to mature, I think it has to begin to take into account these other things the brain does, because it's missing a lot of what the brain does. Now, as for AI, yeah, I mean, I share some concern about what would happen if we had a general AI. I'm not sure we're quite there yet, but for maybe the first time, it feels like we're in punching distance. And you think about it, our brains have not changed much in the past 200,000 years or so. I mean, like people lived 200,000 years ago, they're just as smart as we are now. We just have more knowledge, So, but a general AI, a true general intelligence, if it can become intelligent, and it could evolve on a millisecond level. Our brains take millions of years to evolve, and now we have something that can evolve very, very quickly. And if it could do that, you got to wonder, after a few ticks of evolution, what are we to them? And this other people have sounded this alarm too. I just say there is reason why we should be cautious, because the outcomes of these, as with everything, there's often unintended consequences. And there could be some big ones with AI.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and your ideas and your work today. Last question I'd like to ask you: is there something that you would like to be asked that you're not asked about in your interviews? Something that you would like to share, because we'd love to hear it.
Wow, I don't know. We covered a lot of territory. I've sort of talked a lot about my work now. I play bass. If that asked me, do you play bass? I'll say yes. There. I love playing music too. That's my main hobby. And you meet a lot of scientists who play music, and I think there's something there. Especially, I learned music first as a kid. I think learning music teaches you. It teaches you discipline. It teaches you goal direction. It teaches you, you gotta be in there, and you gotta practice regularly. And it teaches you a lot of skills that are very valuable later in life. So I'd say parents, encourage your kids to pick up an instrument.
Is there any connection between the oscillations of music and the oscillations of the brain? Well, obviously, when you enjoy music, you're listening to music. It's oscillations that you're enjoying, correct?
Well, where did music come from? Your brain's an oscillating harmonic machine. So music didn't just come out. Music wasn't an inevitability. I think music was created by the brain, because your brain is a rhythmic machine.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you so much, Professor. I'd like to end by saying that I'm really, really excited about your work. I think it's much more important than even the credit you've gotten for. Despite or apart from the reality that you've already been extremely influential in neuroscience, I think your influence has yet to be understood completely, if you don't mind me offering my 2 cents about that. So congratulations, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk today.
Thank you so much. That's very kind of you to say, and I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
Okay, take care.